December 24th, 1944. Somewhere in rural Nebraska. Feldwebel Klaus Richter stood at the wooden gate of the work camp, his hands shaking not from the cold but from disbelief. Before him stood an American farmer named Harold Peterson, a man whose calloused hands and sun-weathered face spoke of decades working the land. Peterson gestured toward his pickup truck parked outside the barbed wire fence and spoke words through the translator that made no sense. He was inviting Klaus, an enemy soldier, to spend Christmas Eve at his home with his family. "This must be a trick," Klaus whispered to his fellow prisoner, Georg Schmidt, who stood beside him. They had been working Peterson's sugar beet fields for 3 months, but this invitation shattered every assumption they held about Americans, about captivity, about what it meant to be an enemy. Georg adjusted the large PW letters sewn onto his jacket, the permanent brand marking them as prisoners of war, and looked at the American guards for confirmation. The guards simply nodded and smiled. This was really happening. What these German soldiers didn't understand was that they were about to experience something that would prove more devastating to Nazi ideology than any battlefield defeat. Across America during the winters of 1943, 1944, and 1945, thousands of German prisoners of war received invitations into American homes for Christmas dinner. These acts of extraordinary kindness from families whose sons were fighting and dying in Europe would fundamentally transform how these captured soldiers understood America, democracy, and the propaganda they had been taught to believe. The journey to this improbable moment had begun with America's desperate need for farm labor. By 1943, with millions of young American men overseas fighting the war, rural communities faced a catastrophic shortage of workers. Crops rotted in fields. Harvest deadlines passed. Entire agricultural regions teetered on the edge of collapse. The solution arrived in the form of the very men who had tried to destroy them. Over 425,000 German prisoners of war, spread across 700 camps in 46 states, would become the backbone of American agriculture during the final years of the war. Crimson program brought German prisoners into direct contact with American civilians in ways that military planners had never anticipated. These weren't faceless enemies glimpsed across a battlefield. These were young men, many that accumulated like snowfall. A thermos of hot coffee offered on a freezing morning. A farmer showing a prisoner the correct way to operate machinery, teaching rather than commanding. Children waving from farmhouse windows at men who wore enemy uniforms. These simple gestures created hairline fractures in the propaganda fortress these German soldiers carried in their minds. By late 1943, relationships had developed that transcended the prisoner and captor dynamic. Farmers who initially viewed German POWs with suspicion found themselves respecting the work ethic and skill these young men brought to their fields. Many prisoners had been farmers themselves before conscription into Hitler's army. They understood soil and seasons, planting and harvest. They worked with the desperate intensity of men grateful for outdoor labor that kept them away from battlefields where their countrymen were dying. Unteroffizier Fritz Müller worked the tobacco fields of Kentucky under the supervision of William Garrett, a farmer who had lost his own son at Normandy just months earlier. The irony wasn't lost on either man. Yet Garrett treated Fritz with patient instruction, correcting his mistakes without anger, sharing his water jug during breaks in the oppressive summer heat. When Fritz accidentally damaged a piece of equipment, he braced for punishment that never came. Garrett simply showed him how to repair it, then reminded him to be more careful next time. Fritz would later write, "This man whose son I might have killed treated me like a human being. How could our propaganda be true when this grief-stricken father showed me mercy?" As autumn faded into winter and Christmas approached, something remarkable began happening across rural America. Farmers who had worked alongside German prisoners for months started extending invitations that violated every protocol of war. "Come to our homes, share our holiday meal, meet our families, be our guests." The invitations came from communities that had every reason to hate, towns that had sent their sons to die fighting the German army, families that had received telegrams informing them their boys would never come home. Yet here they stood, offering bread to those who had broken theirs. The American military authorities found themselves in an impossible position. Technically, fraternization between prisoners and civilians violated numerous regulations. The Geneva Convention against American forces. German prisoners in America sat at dinner tables with American families, sharing roast turkey and listening to Christmas carols. Obergefreiter Paul Fischer, working at a camp in Wisconsin, received an invitation from the Miller family, dairy farmers who employed him to help with their morning and evening milking. He later described the moment in a letter that survived the war. Mrs. Miller stood at the camp gate with her husband. She spoke no German, and I spoke no English, but she held out her hand and smiled. The translator said, "They want you to come to their home for Christmas Eve." I thought I had misunderstood. Enemy prisoners don't eat with their captors' families. But the translator repeated it. I looked at the guard, who nodded permission. I didn't know whether to laugh or cry. Miserable that preceded these dinners revealed the extraordinary nature of what was happening. American families used their carefully rationed sugar, butter, and meat to prepare feasts for men wearing enemy uniforms. Mrs. Margaret Hanson of Nebraska saved her butter ration for 3 weeks to ensure she could properly prepare Christmas cookies for the German prisoners her husband had invited. She used precious sugar meant for her own children to glaze a ham for men whose countrymen had killed her nephew in France. When asked years later why she did it, she said simply, "They were boys far from home. It was Christmas. What else would a Christian do?" We first moments inside American homes prisoners who had been taught that Americans lived in poverty and squalor. Gefreiter Johann Becker, invited to the home of Robert Simmons in rural Ohio, documented his shock with characteristic German precision. The house had electricity in every room, running hot water, a bathroom with porcelain fixtures. The living room was warm despite the December cold outside. These were not wealthy people, yet they lived better than most German factory owners. Our propaganda had said America was falling apart. Instead, I found abundance and comfort that exceeded anything I knew in Germany before the war. Presumption meals themselves became lessons in American prosperity that no propaganda film could match. Tables groaned under the weight of roasted turkeys that weighed 20 pounds or more. Mashed potatoes swimming in real butter arrived in bowls large enough to feed an entire German squad. Sweet potatoes glazed with brown sugar and topped with marshmallows, that strange American confection German. First World War, parents who had sons fighting in Europe, children who should have feared these enemy soldiers but instead stared with innocent curiosity. The conversation, translated haltingly through those family members who spoke some German, or prisoners who had learned bits of English, revealed shared humanity that propaganda had tried to erase. Feldwebel Ernst Wagner spent Christmas 1944 with the Thompson family in Iowa. Mr. Thompson had 3 sons in the military, 2 fighting in Europe and 1 in the Pacific. The family had every reason to refuse any kindness to German soldiers, yet Mrs. Thompson insisted on inviting Ernst and 2 other prisoners who worked their farm. She seated them at her table and served them the same meal prepared for her family. When Ernst expressed confusion about why she would do this, Mrs. Thompson's response devastated every assumption he carried. "My boys are somewhere far from home tonight," she said through her daughter who translated. "I pray that wherever they are, someone is showing them the same kindness I show you. We're all somebody's son." Crimson, that statement, repeated in various forms at dinner tables across America, became the moral foundation that justified these extraordinary acts of hospitality. American parents who fed German prisoners weren't betraying their own sons fighting overseas. They were demonstrating the values those sons were fighting to defend. Democracy meant treating even enemies with dignity. Christianity meant loving your enemy, not just speaking the words but living them. American abundance meant having enough to share, even with those who had tried to destroy you. The religious dimensions of these Christmas celebrations created particularly powerful moments. Many German prisoners attended church services with their American hosts, sitting in pews alongside families who had lost sons to German bullets. At St. John's Lutheran Church in Minnesota, Pastor Anderson insisted that 3 German prisoners attending Christmas Eve service be welcomed without restriction. The congregation, though initially uncomfortable, followed their pastor's lead. When the time came to sing Silent Night, the Germans sang in their native language, while the Americans sang in English. 2 versions of the same carol, interweaving in the candlelit sanctuary. Several witnesses remembered grown men weeping openly as the words, "Sleep in heavenly peace," echoed in both German and English. Crimson, these religious experiences carried weight beyond their immediate spiritual impact. Many German prisoners had been taught that Americans were constructed. The children at these Christmas moments of transformation, kids too young to fully understand that these men in prison uniforms were supposed to be monsters, approached them with unfiltered curiosity and surprising kindness. 7-year-old Tommy Peterson gave Obergefreiter Schmidt one of his precious toy soldiers as a Christmas gift. 8-year-old Mary Hansen insisted that the German prisoner working her family's farm sit beside her at dinner and taught him to say Merry Christmas in English. These innocent interactions demonstrated a simple truth that ideology had tried to hide. Children instinctively recognized common humanity unless taught otherwise. The gifts exchanged during these Christmas visits often carried meaning beyond their material value. American families gave prisoners small items that seemed insignificant but represented precious commodities in wartime: a bar of soap, a package of cigarettes, a hand-knitted scarf, writing paper, and envelopes. These modest presents demonstrated that Americans saw prisoners as human beings deserving of basic comforts, rather than enemies deserving only the minimum required by Geneva Convention protocols. Passports, lacking any material possessions with which to reciprocate, often created handmade gifts using whatever materials they could access. Carved wooden ornaments, drawings and sketches, poems written in German. These humble offerings frequently became treasured family heirlooms, preserved for generations as reminders of an extraordinary moment when enemies became guests and strangers became friends, if only for one evening. Not every community embraced this practice of inviting prisoners to Christmas dinner. In some towns, particularly those that had suffered heavy casualties, the idea of treating German soldiers with kindness provoked outrage. Letters to local newspapers condemned families who showed hospitality to prisoners. Some farmers who extended invitations faced social ostracism from neighbors who viewed such acts as betrayal. The American Legion post in one Kansas town passed a resolution condemning the practice and urging military authorities to prohibit it. Safest, even in communities divided over the propriety of these invitations, the practice continued. Those families who chose to host prisoners often defended their decisions with quiet dignity. They weren't celebrating the enemy. They were demonstrating the values that made America worth fighting for. They weren't dishonoring their sons in uniform. They were. America fundamentally changed. They had witnessed abundance, but abundance alone couldn't explain the generosity they encountered. They had experienced kindness, but simple kindness couldn't account for families sharing their Christmas with men whose countrymen had killed their sons. What they witnessed was something their ideology had told them didn't exist. A society that could afford to treat enemies with dignity, because it was strong enough that enemies posed no existential threat. Gefreiter Wilhelm Schneider, who spent Christmas 1944 with a family in Nebraska, attempted to reconcile his experience with everything he had been taught. We were told Americans were weak, divided, incapable of sacrifice. Yet this family that lost their eldest son at Anzio invited me, a German soldier, into their home for Christmas. They had so little compared to what we saw in the camps, yet they shared what they had. The strength this required, the certainty in their own values. This was not weakness. This was power we could never defeat, because it came from conviction rather than coercion. In prison, the psychological transformation that resulted from these Christmas dinners often proved more complete than any formal re-education program the American military attempted. When prisoners returned to their camps after these visits, they carried stories that spread through the compounds like wildfire. Men who hadn't received invitations listened in disbelief as their comrades described being treated as honored guests by families whose sons were fighting the German army. The cognitive dissonance proved overwhelming for many. How could Nazi racial theory be correct when supposedly inferior Americans demonstrated such moral superiority? How could Germany be destined to rule when America could afford to show mercy to enemies? Missions, the letters these prisoners sent home, when they could send them at all, became inadvertent propaganda against the Nazi regime. Though German military censors tried to suppress correspondence that might undermine civilian morale, many messages got through. Wives and mothers in bombed-out German cities received letters describing Christmas dinners with American families that served more food than German civilians had seen in years. The contrast between American abundance and German scarcity, between American generosity and German brutality, between American confidence and German desperation, became impossible to ignore. Seizing 1945 dawned and Germany's defeat became inevitable. The significance of these Christmas celebrations took on new meaning. Prisoners who had been invited into American homes for the holidays became in conformity. Kremlin partition process that began after Germany's surrender in May 1945 created a cruel reversal of fortune. Prisoners who had spent Christmas in American homes found themselves returning to a homeland devastated beyond recognition. Cities reduced to rubble, infrastructure destroyed, food supplies non-existent. The contrast between the America they were leaving and the Germany to which they returned provided a final, devastating lesson about which system had proven superior. Many former prisoners maintained correspondence with the American families who had hosted them for Christmas. These letters, preserved in attics and family archives across America, document relationships that survived war and distance. Gefreiter Hans Müller exchanged Christmas cards with the Johnson family of Wisconsin for 37 years after the war ended. Obergefreiter Kurt Bauer visited the Peterson farm in Nebraska 3 times between 1960 and 1978, each time bringing gifts from Germany for the family that had shown him kindness during his captivity. These enduring connections demonstrated that the relationships forged during those Christmas dinners transcended the temporary circumstances of war. The American families who opened their homes to German prisoners during the war years rarely sought recognition for their actions. Most viewed their hospitality as simple Christian charity or basic human decency, rather than anything remarkable. When asked decades later about their decision to invite enemies to their Christmas tables, they typically responded with confusion about why anyone would find it noteworthy. It was Christmas, they would say. They were far from home. We had food to share. What else would we do? Krim's attitude toward extraordinary kindness revealed something essential about the American character that the German prisoners encountered. The generosity wasn't calculated strategy or propaganda operation. It emerged organically from values deeply embedded in American culture. Neighbors helping neighbors, extending hospitality to strangers, treating others as you wished to be treated. These weren't abstract principles taught in schools, but lived practices demonstrated through countless small acts of daily kindness. Temptation. The German prisoners who experienced American Christmas celebrations carried those memories for the rest of their lives. Many played crucial roles in rebuilding Germany after the war, bringing with them lessons learned at American dinner tables about democracy, prosperity, and human dignity. America than Germans who had never been captured. They were more likely to support democratic government, embrace free market economics, and advocate for German-American partnership. The Christmas dinners and similar acts of American kindness had accomplished what decades of propaganda and coercion never could. They had won hearts and minds through demonstration rather than declaration. Wilhelm Hoffmann, the same skeletal soldier who had trembled before his first Thanksgiving dinner at Camp Hearn in 1943, spent Christmas Eve 1944 at the home of James Morrison, a farmer in Texas who had lost 2 sons fighting in Europe. Hoffmann later described that evening as the most transformative experience of his life. Mr. Morrison said grace before dinner. He thanked God for the food, for his family's safety, and he prayed for peace. Then he looked at me and said through the translator, "I pray my boys who died were shown the same mercy I show you tonight." I wept like a child. The strength this man possessed, the certainty in his values that allowed him to feed his son's enemy, this was power beyond anything Hitler ever commanded. In that moment, I understood we had already lost the war, because we never understood what we were fighting against. The Christmas celebrations of 1943, 1944, and 1945 became part of a larger pattern of American treatment of German prisoners that fundamentally undermined Nazi ideology. While propaganda had promised that captured soldiers would face brutality and starvation, They instead encountered abundance and dignity. While racial theory had declared Americans weak and degenerate, prisoners witnessed strength expressed through mercy rather than cruelty. While Nazi philosophy had preached that might makes right, prisoners learned that moral authority derived from treating even enemies with humanity. Immigration of inviting German prisoners to American homes for Christmas created complications for military authorities trying to maintain proper distance between captors and captives. Some camps prohibited the practice entirely. Others allowed it only under strict supervision. Still others looked the other way, recognizing that these civilian expressions of hospitality accomplished more effective re-education than any formal program could achieve. The inconsistency frustrated military planners who preferred clear protocols, but it reflected the decentralized nature of American society, where local communities made their own decisions based on their own values. By Christmas 1945, with the war over and repatriation underway, that extraordinary circumstances had created connections that peacetime would never replicate. The legacy of these Christmas celebrations extended far beyond the individual prisoners and families involved. They became part of the larger story of how America won not just a military victory, but a moral one. The decision to treat enemies with dignity rather than brutality, to share abundance rather than exploit scarcity, to demonstrate American values through action rather than propaganda. These choices helped transform former enemies into future allies. The Marshall Plan that rebuilt Germany after the war succeeded partly because thousands of German soldiers had already witnessed American generosity firsthand and could testify to their countrymen that American promises of help could be trusted. In the decades after the war, as former prisoners returned to visit the American families who had hosted them during their captivity, these reunions attracted media attention that helped Americans understand the lasting impact of wartime kindness. Television news programs documented elderly German men embracing elderly American farmers, their shared memories of Christmas dinners transcending language barriers and fading recollection. These human interest stories reminded a new generation that, even in the midst of total war, individuals had chosen mercy over hatred, connection over division, humanity over ideology. The German prisoners who sat at American tables during the Christmas seasons of 1943 through 1945 had arrived expecting brutality and received generosity. They had been taught that Americans were weak and discovered strength expressed through confidence rather than fear. They had believed the master race propaganda and learned that true superiority came from moral authority rather than military might. These lessons, delivered through turkey dinners and Christmas carols, through children's innocence and parents' grace, through farmers' patience and families' hospitality, proved more devastating to Nazi ideology than any battlefield defeat. In American homes across the heartland, over shared meals and halting conversations, in the glow of Christmas trees and the warmth of wood stoves, a quiet revolution took place. Enemy soldiers became human beings. Propaganda dissolved in the face of lived experience. Hatred gave way to understanding. And in those ordinary homes, practicing the extraordinary act of treating enemies as guests, American families demonstrated the power of their values more effectively than any army could. They won the war not through superior firepower, more than a footnote to World War II history. It reveals the transformative power of treating enemies with dignity, the strength that comes from living your stated values even toward those who oppose you, and the possibility that even in war's darkest moments, human connection can transcend the boundaries that conflict creates. Those Christmas dinners, shared between families and prisoners, between victors and vanquished, between Americans confident in their cause and Germans questioning everything they had been taught, became lessons in democracy more effective than any classroom could provide. They were seeds planted during wartime that would blossom into lasting peace. Proof that the most powerful weapon in any conflict is not the one that destroys, but the one that builds. Not hatred, but hope. Not division, but the simple, revolutionary act of setting an extra place at the table and saying, even to your enemy, you are welcome here.